Have you ever noticed how sometimes one name suddenly explodes all over the internet? And everyone's asking the same question: who is Jamal Roberts? From a child who grew up with nothing to becoming a figure who inspires millions, Jamal's journey isn't just another success story. It's a tale of struggle, heartbreak, triumph, and life lessons that can change the way we see our own dreams. So, are you ready to dive into the zero-to-hero story that's taking the internet by storm? Jamal Roberts wasn't born into luxury, fame, or even stability. In fact, if you had met him as a child, you probably would never have guessed that one day his name would erupt across the internet and echo around the world. He was raised in a small, working-class neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and dreams often felt more like fantasies than realistic goals. Jamal's early life was painted with shades of hardship. A tiny house that often felt too cramped for the number of people living inside it, parents who worked tirelessly just to put food on the table, and the constant reminder that money, or the lack of it, was a wall separating him from the kind of life he secretly wished for. But beyond the financial struggles, what made Jamal's childhood truly unique was the sense of mystery that surrounded him. He wasn't like other kids in the neighborhood who spent their afternoons playing ball in the streets or hanging out at the corner store. Instead, Jamal often disappeared into his own world, sometimes sketching on scraps of paper, sometimes writing down random ideas, and other times simply sitting quietly, observing life around him. Neighbors would occasionally comment, "That boy's got something different about him. He's watching the world in a way we don't." It was almost as if Jamal, even at a young age, knew he was meant for something bigger, even if he couldn't quite articulate it yet. At school, Jamal wasn't the star student. He wasn't the one teachers pointed to as a shining example of success. In fact, he often struggled to keep up, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his mind wandered to places far beyond the classroom walls. He dreamed big dreams, dreams that didn't fit neatly into the limited expectations set for kids like him. When teachers asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, Jamal never gave the safe answers like doctor, lawyer, or teacher. Instead, he'd say something vague but bold like, "I want to make people remember my name." Of course, that answer was often met with chuckles or rolled eyes, but Jamal never flinched. Deep inside, he believed it. Home life was far from easy. His family faced financial instability, and sometimes there wasn't enough food to go around. Jamal learned early how to stretch what little he had, and that sense of survival would later become one of his greatest strengths. His father, though strict, often reminded him, "Son, the world doesn't give you anything for free. If you want something, you have to fight for it." Those words echoed in Jamal's mind throughout his youth, a guiding mantra that stuck even when life felt unbearable. His mother, on the other hand, provided a softer influence, encouraging his creativity, often telling him, "You see the world differently, Jamal. Don't lose that." By the time Jamal reached his teenage years, his personality had already been shaped by this push and pull dynamic between hardship and hope. The neighborhood saw him as quiet and mysterious, but those closest to him knew he carried an inner fire. It was this combination, the rough edges of poverty and the spark of creativity, that laid the foundation for the man the internet would one day be obsessed with. As Jamal stepped into his teenage years, the challenges of his childhood didn't disappear, they only grew sharper. The weight of responsibility began pressing down on him, as it does for many kids growing up in tough neighborhoods. But instead of crushing him, it fueled a restless energy inside. Jamal wasn't content to simply exist within the invisible boundaries that poverty and circumstance had drawn around him. He wanted to push past them even if he didn't yet know how. By this time, Jamal's curiosity and creativity had blossomed into a set of passions that stood out. While his peers were mostly preoccupied with fitting in or finding trouble on the streets, Jamal was fixated on the idea of making something of himself, something bigger than the world around him. He would spend late nights sketching ideas, writing notes, and mapping out impossible dreams in old notebooks. Some nights, his mother would quietly open his bedroom door, expecting to find him asleep, but instead, she'd see him hunched over a piece of paper, scribbling as though the future depended on it. "One day, people are going to know who I am," he whispered to himself in the silence of those nights. High school wasn't much kinder to him than earlier school years. He wasn't the best student academically, and the social scene often made him feel like an outsider. But Jamal wasn't trying to be the star of the classroom or the most popular kid in school. His ambitions were far beyond the school walls. He started developing big dreams, often talking about moving out of the neighborhood, traveling the world, and building a career that would make people remember his name. Friends sometimes laughed it off, telling him, "Man, you gotta be realistic." But Jamal would just smile. In his mind, being realistic was just another word for giving up. Music, art, and storytelling became Jamal's refuge during these years. He'd lose himself for hours listening to records, copying down lyrics, or practicing his own voice. He experimented with rhythm, with words, with style, searching for a way to express the swirl of emotions and ambitions building inside him. At times, he performed for small groups of friends in backyards or at school events, and even though he didn't have much, his energy commanded attention. People who watched him perform would often say, "There's something about him. He's different." But chasing dreams came with sacrifices. Jamal often had to balance odd jobs just to help his family while secretly holding on to his vision of a brighter future. He would deliver groceries, sweep up shops, and do whatever he could to earn money. Every dollar he saved wasn't just survival. It was an investment in the dream he was carefully nurturing. He'd spend what little extra cash he had on notebooks, secondhand equipment, or cheap recording sessions at local studios. Each small step felt monumental, like laying bricks for a castle he was determined to build. Teenage Jamal carried two versions of himself, one that lived in the harsh realities of his environment, and another that thrived in the limitless world of his imagination. This tension gave him a resilience most people his age didn't have. He was learning, slowly but surely, that greatness wasn't about where you started but about how fiercely you refused to stay there. By the end of his teenage years, Jamal's dreams weren't just fantasies anymore. They were blueprints, fragile, unfinished, but alive, and he was ready to fight for them no matter how long it took. When Jamal decided to take his dreams seriously, reality struck him with full force. The world outside his neighborhood wasn't waiting with open arms to welcome an ambitious young man with no connections, no money, and no roadmap. The first thing he learned was that talent alone wasn't enough. He had the drive, the voice, and the ideas, but breaking through meant navigating a system that was designed to be unforgiving. Local venues often brushed him off, telling him they were already booked, or that they weren't looking for his type of act. Some didn't even bother to give him a chance to perform. Each rejection chipped at his confidence, but Jamal kept showing up, knocking on doors and pushing himself into spaces that didn't want him there. Recording music or producing any creative work was a whole different struggle. Studio time was expensive, way beyond what he could realistically afford. Jamal often resorted to recording on borrowed equipment, in makeshift setups inside friends' basements or cramped apartments where the sound of traffic outside leaked into the mic. He would stay up until dawn, editing tracks on outdated software that crashed half the time, but even those rough, imperfect songs carried his heart and determination. He knew the quality wasn't there yet, but to him it was progress, proof that he was moving forward inch by inch even if no one else could see it. Financial hardship was another wall he constantly slammed into. While chasing his passion, Jamal still had to work whatever jobs he could get, washing dishes, sweeping floors, stocking shelves. It was exhausting to clock in for long hours of labor and then pour whatever energy remained into music late at night. Sometimes he questioned whether it was even possible to chase a dream while trying to survive day-to-day life. The thought of giving up lingered in his mind, especially during nights when exhaustion outweighed inspiration. But somehow, every time he was close to breaking, he'd hear a song on the radio or see a performance that reignited the fire inside him, reminding him why he started in the first place. And then came the ridicule. Not everyone in his world believed in him. Friends, neighbors, and even some family members told him he was wasting his time. "Dreams don't pay the bills," they'd say. "Be practical. Get a real job." Their words stung because they came from people he loved, people who only wanted him to avoid disappointment. But Jamal wasn't built to settle. He carried those doubts like fuel, channeling them into his late-night writing sessions and low-budget recordings. The more people doubted him, the harder he pushed. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. There were nights when Jamal sat alone, staring at his unfinished lyrics, wondering if anyone would ever care about the words he was pouring out of his soul. There were performances in half-empty rooms where the audience barely clapped. There were days he couldn't scrape together enough money to record or promote his work. Each of these moments could have been the end of his journey, a fork in the road where most people turn back. But Jamal chose to press on. What set Jamal apart wasn't just his ambition but his refusal to let struggle define him. He embraced failure as part of the process. Every rejection, every setback, every moment of doubt became a lesson. Slowly, he began to understand that success isn't a straight line. It's a messy, painful climb full of scars and bruises. And Jamal was ready to keep climbing no matter how steep the hill became. For every dreamer, there comes a moment that feels like the universe finally whispers, "You're on the right path." For Jamal, that moment didn't arrive with a grand stage or flashing lights. It came from one small chance, the kind of opportunity that most people might overlook but that he treated as life or death. After months of performing at tiny local gigs where half the audience was too busy drinking to even notice him, Jamal was offered a slot to open at a local community event. It wasn't glamorous, just a small outdoor festival with a shaky sound system and a crowd that wasn't exactly there for the music. But for Jamal, it was everything. That night, nerves raced through his body as he stepped onto the stage. He didn't have backup dancers, expensive lights, or even perfect equipment. What he had was raw energy, an aching hunger, and lyrics that told the truth about his struggles. As he performed, something shifted. People who had been casually walking by began to stop and listen. Heads turned, conversations quieted, and suddenly the crowd that was never meant to be his audience started to feel his words. By the time he finished, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real, genuine claps, cheers, and shouts from people who had just discovered something they didn't expect. But the true breakthrough wasn't just the applause, it was who happened to be in the crowd. Among the listeners that evening was a small-time local producer who had worked with a handful of up-and-coming talents. He approached Jamal afterward, impressed not by fancy production or polish, but by the authenticity and grit in his performance. "You've got something raw," the producer said. "Something people can feel." Those words, simple as they were, became the validation Jamal had been waiting for. For the first time, someone outside his circle recognized his potential. Not as a hobby, not as a passing interest, but as a career worth investing in. That night, Jamal was invited to a real studio session. Not a basement with a borrowed mic, but a space where his voice could be captured the way it was meant to be heard. Walking into that studio for the first time, with its soundproof walls and gleaming equipment, Jamal felt like he had stepped into another world. This was no longer just a dream in his head, it was tangible, alive, and within his grasp. The breakthrough moment wasn't about instant fame. There was no viral video, no sudden record deal that changed his life overnight. Instead, it was the shift in momentum, the first time the doors that had always been slammed shut began to crack open. It was the moment Jamal stopped being the boy who was chasing a silly dream and started becoming an artist people believed in. From that point on, Jamal carried himself differently. His performances grew sharper, his confidence bolder. The memory of that first real applause and the producer's encouragement replayed in his head every time doubt tried to creep back in. It was proof that all the sleepless nights, the rejections, and the empty rooms had not been in vain. This was just the beginning, but it was the moment he would later look back on as the spark that lit the fire of his career. Fame doesn't arrive all at once. For Jamal, it came like a slow sunrise, peeking over the horizon until suddenly the world looked completely different. After his breakthrough moment, word began to spread. First through whispers in the local scene, then through videos that friends uploaded online. Clips of his performances, raw and unpolished, started bouncing around social media. At first, Jamal didn't even realize people were sharing them. He only noticed when strangers began stopping him on the street saying, "Hey, aren't you that guy who performed at the festival?" Those encounters, small as they seemed, filled him with a rush he couldn't describe. For the first time, his voice was echoing beyond the four walls of his neighborhood. The local gigs that once felt like dead ends began to change. Instead of performing to a handful of distracted faces, he now walked on stage to see audiences waiting for him. People knew his songs. They weren't just hearing him for the first time, they were singing along. That moment, hearing his own lyrics shouted back at him by a crowd, was something Jamal would never forget. It was proof that his words mattered, that his story had become part of something bigger. As the buzz grew louder, opportunities followed. Radio stations that had once ignored his demo tapes began calling him in for interviews. Local newspapers wrote pieces about the young voice taking over the city. He was even invited to open for bigger artists passing through town, a chance to stand under professional stage lights and share the spotlight, if only for a few songs. Each step felt surreal, like he was living inside a dream he'd once scribbled in a notebook. But the most unforgettable moment of his early rise came the day his first single hit streaming platforms. Jamal had poured everything into that track. The pain of his childhood, the struggles of chasing his dream, and the fire of wanting something more. When the song went live, he stayed up all night refreshing the page, watching the numbers climb. Dozens of plays turned into hundreds, hundreds into thousands. He couldn't believe that people in cities he had never visited were now listening to his story through their headphones. And then came the messages. Fans began reaching out, telling him how his words helped them through tough times. Strangers explained that they saw their own lives reflected in his lyrics. For Jamal, that was the true taste of fame, not the flashing lights or the articles, but the realization that he had connected with people he had never met, people who now felt less alone because of his music. Yet even in this rising recognition, Jamal stayed grounded. He still remembered the nights of rejection, the gigs where no one clapped, the voices telling him to give up. That memory kept him humble even as his world expanded. Fame was new, thrilling, and intoxicating, but Jamal knew it was fragile, a fire that had to be carefully protected if it was going to last. This was his first real taste of what he had always dreamed of. And though it was only the beginning, it carried with it a sweet and powerful truth. Jamal Roberts was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was becoming a name people would not forget. Fame, as Jamal quickly discovered, is a double-edged sword. At first, it felt like everything he had ever wanted: the applause, the recognition, the validation that his struggle had been worth it. But as the months rolled by, the glow of success came with shadows he never expected. Suddenly, every step he took was under a microscope. Strangers who once admired his rise now felt entitled to his life. They followed his social media obsessively, dissecting his posts, criticizing his clothes, even questioning his friendships. Jamal realized that in exchange for the stage and the spotlight, he had given away something deeply personal: his privacy. It wasn't just the fans, the media played a part too. Stories about Jamal started appearing online, some true, some twisted into half-truths designed to grab attention. Headlines exaggerated conflicts, inventing drama where none existed. A simple night out with friends became Jamal Roberts spiraling into the party life. A missed appearance at a small event, due to exhaustion, was spun into Jamal too arrogant for commitments. Reading those words stung, especially because he had always tried to stay grounded. It was his first painful lesson. Fame sells not just through achievements, but through controversy. The pressure built in other ways too. Expectations soared with every new release. Audiences who once cheered for his rise now demanded more. Bigger shows, better songs, flawless performances. The joy of creating music, the passion that had carried him since childhood, started to feel like a burden. Jamal found himself awake at 3 a.m., staring at blank pages, haunted by the fear that maybe he had peaked too soon, that maybe he couldn't live up to the hype. That fear ate at him, turning rehearsals into stressful battles instead of celebrations of his craft. And then there were the people around him. Some friendships crumbled under the weight of his success. Old friends accused him of changing, of leaving them behind, while new people appeared, drawn not by who Jamal was, but by what he had become. It was hard to know who was genuine and who just wanted to be close to the fame. That loneliness cut deep, because in rooms full of people cheering his name, Jamal often felt more isolated than ever. The darkest moments, however, came from within. The sudden shift from being overlooked to being idolized was overwhelming. To cope, Jamal sometimes leaned on unhealthy escapes, long nights, distractions, and the temptation of substances that others in the industry offered. He knew the dangers, but the weight of pressure made those choices feel like relief, even if only for a moment. It was a dangerous path, one that threatened to undo everything he had built. Yet, in the midst of this storm, Jamal began to recognize something important. Fame wasn't the enemy, but how he managed it would define his future. He had dreamed of this life, but he hadn't realized it would test not just his talent, but his spirit. The dark side of fame wasn't just about paparazzi, criticism, or rumors. It was about the battle to hold on to yourself when the world tries to turn you into someone else. For Jamal, facing these challenges became another kind of test, one that was less about microphones and crowds and more about inner strength. He learned that surviving fame required more than ambition. It required resilience, self-awareness, and the courage to keep going even when the applause faded. This period marked one of the hardest stretches of his life. But as painful as it was, it also prepared him for the moment when everything would change again, not with scandal or struggle, but with the biggest milestone of his career. Every artist dreams of that one moment that defines their career, the moment when years of struggle, sacrifice, and doubt finally crystallize into triumph. For Jamal Roberts, that moment came in a way so spectacular that even he could hardly believe it. After enduring the crushing weight of fame's darker side, Jamal found himself standing on the brink of the biggest opportunity of his life, an invitation to perform on one of the world's largest stages. It wasn't just any performance. This was the night that would put his name alongside legends. The arena was sold out, with tens of thousands of people waiting in anticipation, and millions more tuning in through live broadcast. The spotlight, once intimidating, now felt like home. As the lights dimmed and the crowd roared, Jamal took a deep breath backstage, remembering the kid he once was, the boy who grew up in hardship, the teenager with big dreams, the young man who nearly broke under the weight of expectation. Now here he was about to take the stage not as a dreamer but as a star. When the first notes of his set rang out, the crowd erupted. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. Every lyric, every beat, every movement carried the story of his journey, a story of resilience, pain, and perseverance. For Jamal, this wasn't simply about music. It was about proving to himself that all those years of struggle had led to this very moment. That night, critics who had once doubted him now praised his artistry. Headlines the next morning declared his performance electrifying, unforgettable, and even career-defining. Social media was flooded with clips of his set, fans calling it one of the greatest live performances they had ever seen. The same industry insiders who once overlooked him were now calling him a force of nature. It was a turning point, the moment Jamal officially crossed over from being just another rising star to a household name. But beyond the fame and praise, what made this milestone truly unforgettable for Jamal was deeply personal. In the front row of that massive audience sat his mother, the woman who had held him through every hardship, who had worked endless hours just to put food on the table. When their eyes met during the performance, Jamal felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just performing for fame, money, or recognition. He was performing for her, for the sacrifices she made, for the child version of himself who once thought dreams were impossible. That connection gave the night a depth no award or applause could ever match. And yes, awards followed. The performance catapulted him to win his first major accolade, a recognition that marked him as one of the most influential artists of his generation. For Jamal, it was validation that his voice mattered, not just as an entertainer, but as someone who had something meaningful to say. The kid who once felt invisible had now become a symbol of possibility for others who came from nothing. This milestone wasn't just about the glory of the spotlight, it was about arrival. It was proof that all the storms he had faced, the poverty, the rejection, the criticism, the internal battles, had forged him into someone strong enough to stand tall in front of the world. And while it may have looked like the climax of his story for Jamal, it was only the beginning of something greater. Because after the world celebrated his rise, Jamal realized he had a new mission: to use his platform not just for himself, but to make a difference in the lives of others. After his breakthrough and the world finally recognizing his talent, Jamal Roberts found himself at a crossroads that every major star eventually faces. What do you do once you've made it? For some, the answer is to chase more fame, more money, more accolades. But for Jamal, who had lived through poverty, heartbreak, and the weight of struggle, success was never meant to be hoarded. He knew what it felt like to be unseen, to feel like the world didn't care, and he vowed that if he ever had a voice loud enough to be heard, he'd use it to lift others up. It started quietly. At first, Jamal began funding scholarships for kids from his old neighborhood, children who, just like him, grew up with empty pockets but full of dreams. He didn't make flashy announcements or turn it into a PR stunt. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, ensuring those kids had school supplies, mentorship, and the support system he never had. For him, it wasn't charity. It was a responsibility. But as his fame grew, so did his reach. Soon, Jamal began partnering with organizations focused on fighting poverty and expanding opportunities for underprivileged youth. He visited schools, sat down with students, and shared his story openly, not as some untouchable superstar, but as someone who had been exactly where they were. When he spoke about sleeping on a torn-up mattress, working odd jobs to survive, or hearing no 1,000 times before hearing yes, the kids didn't just listen. They believed him because his scars were real. Beyond education, Jamal also became vocal about mental health, a subject often stigmatized in the communities he grew up in. Having personally battled anxiety and the weight of fame, he opened up about therapy, self-care, and the importance of asking for help. His honesty resonated, and suddenly, fans who had once looked up to him for his music were now finding comfort in his vulnerability. He showed that strength isn't about pretending everything is perfect. It's about admitting when you're struggling and finding ways to heal. He also turned his tours into opportunities to give back. At nearly every stop, a portion of the proceeds went to local charities, food banks, or shelters. His concerts weren't just about entertainment, they became engines of community support. Fans who bought tickets realized they weren't just investing in a night of music, they were helping someone in need. And that gave Jamal's work a sense of purpose far beyond the stage lights. What made Jamal different was that he never let his giving become detached from who he was. He didn't just write checks and disappear. He showed up. He stood in the classrooms, walked through the community centers, listened to the stories of those still fighting battles he knew too well. For him, this was the true reward of fame, turning his platform into a bridge that connected hope with opportunity. Critics and industry insiders often say that fame reveals who you really are. For Jamal, it revealed compassion. It revealed a man who carried his past not as a burden but as a compass, guiding him toward making sure others didn't have to endure the same loneliness and hopelessness he once felt. His acts of giving weren't just about charity, they were about legacy. And yet, as much good as Jamal was doing for others, life still had more tests in store for him. Because just when it seemed like everything was finally aligned, tragedy struck again in ways that reminded him no amount of fame or money could shield someone from life's most painful realities. For all the success Jamal Roberts had achieved, the fame, the recognition, the chance to finally give back, life had a way of reminding him that no one, not even the brightest stars, is immune to pain. Just when he seemed untouchable, riding the wave of everything he had worked for, tragedy struck and shook him to his core. Losing people he loved became one of the hardest chapters in his story. It started when his grandmother, the woman who had raised him and held his world together when everything else was falling apart, passed away. For Jamal, she wasn't just family, she was his anchor, the one who taught him resilience, kindness, and faith in himself even when he had nothing. Her passing felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. No matter how many fans cheered his name or how many stages he stood on, he found himself coming back to empty hotel rooms, drowning in grief. Fame couldn't buy back the person who once sat at the edge of his bed, encouraging him to keep fighting for his dream. But grief didn't stop there. Over time, Jamal faced other personal hardships. The sudden loss of close friends from his neighborhood to violence and addiction, the collapse of relationships strained under the weight of his career, and his own battle with mental health as he tried to balance the chaos of fame with the quiet ache of loneliness. Every tragedy felt like another scar, another reminder of the fragile line between success and despair. In his darkest moments, Jamal admitted that he questioned everything: his career, his purpose, even his ability to go on. The same fans who adored him on stage had no idea that behind the curtain, he sometimes broke down, overwhelmed by the pressure and haunted by the memories of those he had lost. His public smile often hid private tears. Yet, as he had done countless times before, Jamal chose not to let the darkness define him. Instead, he leaned into it, transforming his pain into something powerful. He began channeling his grief into his art, writing lyrics and creating performances that bled with honesty. Songs about loss, resilience, and survival became anthems for fans who were also struggling. Through his vulnerability, he created a bridge that connected his personal sorrow with the pain of others, reminding them that they weren't alone. Beyond music, Jamal sought help, something he once thought was a sign of weakness but came to understand as a form of strength. Therapy, meditation, and leaning on his closest circle of friends gave him the tools to heal slowly. He wasn't ashamed to admit that he needed help, and in doing so, he shattered the stigma for many of his fans who were facing their own silent battles. One of the most powerful ways he honored his losses was by turning them into action. He started initiatives in memory of his grandmother and friends, supporting community centers and outreach programs aimed at preventing violence and addiction among youth. For him, it wasn't enough to simply mourn. He wanted to make sure their deaths meant something, that their lives inspired change. Through all of this, Jamal showed the world a different kind of strength. Not the strength of someone who never falls, but of someone who falls again and again and still finds the courage to rise. His journey through personal loss and hardship wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about embracing the cracks and proving that brokenness could still create something beautiful. And it was this resilience, this unshakable spirit, that would define the final chapter of his story. A legacy that would outlive him and inspire the next generation to rise from their own struggles and chase greatness no matter the odds. As Jamal Roberts' story unfolds, one thing becomes clear. His journey was never just about fame, money, or recognition. It was about transformation, turning hardship into hope, pain into power, and dreams into reality. And perhaps his greatest accomplishment is not what he achieved for himself, but the legacy he leaves